If tariffs are a job shield, why does every new round of tariffs open yet another door for Canada?
And when China freezes Boeing aircraft, who is rewriting the rules of the global supply chain right before our eyes?
There is a growing paradox in the Canada-U.S. trade war. The louder the protectionist slogans, the more the industrial ecosystem gets stretched to the point of snapping itself. The aerospace sector is where that paradox is exposed most nakedly, because it is a machine that only runs when every link moves in the right rhythm. Materials, components, certification, delivery schedules, high-skilled labor, and political trust. All it takes is one link slipping out of rhythm, and the whole line can stop breathing. When Washington puts tariffs on the table as a tool of power, it thinks it is betting on America's enormous market advantage. But what it is really placing on the table sometimes is the stability of the very supply chain it depends on. In that picture, Boeing appears as a convergence point for every pressure at once. On the outside, China is both a large and highly sensitive market, where a single policy decision can turn orders into risk within days. Reuters reported that China directed its domestic airlines to temporarily stop taking deliveries of Boeing aircraft and to stop buying aircraft-related equipment and parts from U.S. companies in retaliation after the U.S. imposed very high tariffs on Chinese goods. Also, according to Reuters, Boeing confirmed that Chinese customers refuse to accept new aircraft because of the tariff issue. China accounts for about 10% of Boeing's backlog, and the company had expected to deliver about 50 planes to China that year, but had to consider redirecting aircraft to other customers when the situation flipped. When a major market can hit the brakes like that, the question is no longer who is right and who is wrong, but rather how many geopolitical whirlpools can an aerospace giant endure before being forced to restructure its own path? On the inside, Boeing must also solve the labor and production capacity problem, something tariff policy cannot solve in its place. In St. Louis, Boeing's defense machinists went through a prolonged strike and only returned to work after reaching a new contract agreement. U.S. media reported the strike lasted about 100 days, involved 3,200 IM District 837 workers, and the accepted deal included a $6,000 signing bonus, 24% wage increases, and improved benefits. The average base pay was cited as rising from $75,000 to $109,000 per year. Reuters had earlier described the offer levels and bargaining tensions, showing that labor costs and production pressure are not a straight line, but a jagged line full of risk. So who will pay the bill for these jagged turns? Companies may try to push it onto consumers, but in aerospace, the ultimate consumer is sometimes the airline, the defense budget, the entire logistics system, meaning it ultimately cycles back into the economy. Wedged between the two clamps of China labor production, every new tariff policy from Washington is like adding another layer of fog over an already crowded runway. Reuters previously reported that leaders of a major North American aerospace union urged the Trump administration to pause tariffs on Canada as it did for Mexico, because the sector's supply chain depends heavily on cross-border trade. The numbers here are what truly deserve reflection. In 2023, Canada exported about 12.8 billion Canadian dollars in aerospace products to the U.S. and imported about 10.2 billion Canadian dollars from the U.S. A two-way flow that reflects an interwoven supply chain rather than a one-way buyer-seller relationship. When a 25% tariff policy is put on the table for Canada, what is threatened is not only parts prices but the operating tempo. Delivery schedules, maintenance contracts, procurement plans, even competitiveness against Airbus. And if costs rise, who pays? Reuters cited analysis that businesses buying aluminum from Canada to process many items will have difficulty avoiding passing costs onto aircraft manufacturers. What do tariffs really protect, jobs or a sense of control? If the goal is to bring production back to the U.S., policy uncertainty often triggers the opposite reflex. Businesses look for places with higher predictability to anchor long-term work. And that is where Canada often steps in as a technical harbor, not through loud declarations, but through stable rules of the game, industrial capacity, and especially standards power. Technical standards, certification standards, safety standards, environmental standards, things the global supply chain must follow if it wants on-time delivery and permits that don't get frozen. In other words, in the era of global supply chains, leverage is not only in the tariff rate. Leverage lies in operational choke points and standards. Who sets them? Who responds fast? Who certifies smoothly? Who has an engineering base and supplier depth strong enough to substitute when one link breaks? Canada has understood that for a long time, and it often plays through institutional infrastructure, industrial clusters in Quebec and Ontario, materials capability and precision manufacturing, subcontractor ecosystems, and integrated relationships that have existed for decades in aircraft production. There is no need to speak in propaganda language. Just look at the traces of investment and contracts and you can see the wind direction. Reuters reported Boeing will invest 240 million Canadian dollars in 3 aerospace development initiatives in Quebec, an innovation infrastructure commitment, not a hit-and-run move. Boeing Canada also said that contracts and industrial content for the P-8 program have created job flows and domestic value, with contract figures of more than 2 billion Canadian dollars awarded to Canadian companies, according to Boeing's own published information. Even if this is not a full relocation like some rumors on social media, it is still evidence of something more subtle. Canada is increasingly becoming an anchor for work with long life cycles and a supply ecosystem that stays stable, exactly what tariffs and policy uncertainty often weaken. At this point, return to Boeing, because the story is not simply that Canada wins or the US loses. The story is how a corporation is forced to optimize risk when geopolitics turns trade into a battlefield. If China freezes acceptance of aircraft, Boeing must find other customers. If labor is tense, Boeing must accept higher costs to stabilize production. If tariffs are applied to Canada, the supply chain becomes even more tangled because components cross the border many times before becoming the final product. And when all variables rise at once, businesses will do what markets always do: disperse risk. What does dispersing risk mean? It means placing more work in places that are predictable, that have supplier infrastructure, that have standards compatibility with the US market, and that have trade relationships deep enough to reduce friction. Along that axis, Canada is not only a neighbor, Canada is an operating component of the North American aerospace system. So why does Washington so easily fall into a position of making things harder for itself? Because tariffs are an easy tool to communicate. Numbers like 25%, 10%, 145% sound very strong. But supply chains do not run on slogans. They run on contracts, standards, delivery schedules, and trust. A tariff strike can create a sense of control in the short term, but it also plants something more toxic in the long term: policy risk. Policy risk changes corporate behavior, reshapes supplier maps, and shifts the location of jobs, often in the direction the original tariff policy did not intend. Try answering a seemingly simple question. If the goal is to keep jobs in America, are jobs kept by raising the cost of imported components or by ensuring businesses have a predictable environment to expand production lines? And if a policy forces manufacturers to stock up before tariffs take effect, to hoard aluminum in advance out of fear of disruption, to renegotiate contracts because costs spike, does that protect or does it create its own bottleneck? Reuters noted that very phenomenon of firms buying inputs ahead and worrying there is no substitute source if tariffs persist. Meanwhile, Canada has an advantage that is rarely said outright, yet pays off enormously in political economy: the ability to turn stability into an asset. Stability is not only political, it is also institutional discipline that lets businesses forecast. And when businesses can forecast, they dare to sign multi-year contracts, dare to train labor, dare to invest in machinery. Precisely here, standards power becomes strength. Compliance with standards helps goods cross the border with fewer interrogations, keeps safety and quality certification from being frozen, and keeps parts flowing smoothly. The global supply chain, in the end, is a problem of friction points. Whoever reduces friction better attracts the flow of work. Another truth must also be seen. Airbus is not standing outside the fight. When Boeing wobbles because of production incidents and because Chinese customers refuse deliveries, Airbus gains an opportunity to strengthen its position, something financial media also note in the context of industry-wide orders and backlogs. When Boeing versus Airbus is already a long-distance race, a geopolitical stumble can widen the gap not in a single quarter, but over many years. Therefore, every tariff move must be weighed. Hitting a trade opponent can inadvertently shoot the competitive capacity of a country's own national champion. In modern trade war, the side that controls standards and supply chain choke points is the side holding the leverage. Tariffs are only noise if they increase uncertainty. When the noise gets loud enough, businesses will look for a quieter zone to place critical work. And once critical work shifts, jobs, income, technological capability, and even domestic political power will shift with it. That is why the controversy is not about how much Boeing moves to Canada. If tariffs repeatedly force companies to restructure risk, who is really the proactive side? Policy wants to force companies to stay, but uncertainty teaches companies how to escape. When China can force Boeing to reroute deliveries, when labor can stretch production timelines, and when tariffs can turn components into a cost burden, the natural reflex of business is to optimize the network, multi-site, multi-source, multi-route, a strategy of escaping dependence. The irony is that this escaping dependence strategy is being pursued by many countries, including Canada, as a new political economy doctrine. If Washington wants a different ending, it must answer practical policy questions. How to reduce institutional risk instead of increasing institutional risk. How to protect jobs by raising productivity and stabilizing inputs, rather than by a tariff blow that breaks the rhythm of the supply chain. And how to use standards power as a positive tool, setting higher standards to pull companies into domestic investment, rather than using tariffs like a hammer smashing the very system that needs the finesse of a Swiss watch. Subscribe to the channel now to follow the next turning points together.